Hello, and you're very welcome to episode 55 of The Fifth Court, a podcast on legal affairs presented by myself, Peter Leonard, barrister.
Myself, Mark Tottenham, barrister and editor of Decisive Law Reports.
Mark, good to see you as always. And last week, you will recall, we had a fascinating discussion, a really fascinating discussion, which I wasn't part of, but I really enjoyed listening back to. And that was the realities of being a devil in our wonderful profession. And as people know, being a devil is how you start out as a barrister. Colleagues Sarah Reid and Aaron Grealish came in to talk to us, and it was really, really good.
Yeah, and shows how you don't notice when you're part of the profession how it's sort of changing incrementally. But, you know, devils working in a completely different way now than they did in those few short years since yourself and myself started out.
And there's nothing like a few tips. I mean, in the good old days, you really kind of belted away, didn't you? And sort of, tried to make your own way. But like a little bit of information like this and this book, which is really, really valuable and really good, is a great help. So we recommend that hugely. And that was a cracker of an interview. People should listen back to it. Okay, well, moving from the barrister's profession to our sister profession, the solicitors. Today in studio, we're going to be joined by the new Director General of the Law Society, Mark Garrett. He's actually been there almost 2 years. He just feels like a more recent appointment. And we're really looking forward to talking to Mark. And obviously, there's a lot of issues currently facing the solicitor's profession. Mark, there are a few pressing issues, you believe?
Definitely, yeah. Certainly the small high street firms are feeling the pinch.
There's a touch of the David and Goliath at the moment, isn't there? The kind of small firm versus the huge firms. Yeah. I mean, you switch on LinkedIn and you see all these firms that are recruiting all the time. And apparently, there's ne'er a trainee down the west of the Shannon. It's rare to find a trainee solicitor these days. It's hard to believe.
Even the smaller sort of Dublin firms who deal with private clients, it's just the money is in the big commercial firms.
Yeah, and your standard solicitor's firm, so important, folks. It is so important. So anyway, we're going to talk to Mark about that and what they're doing within the Law Society to sort of assist those firms and to manage the profession generally. Really looking forward to that. But before we get to those, we've got our 3 cases from Decisive, Mark, which you have chosen. In the first case this week, a local authority had issued a vesting order. You're going to have to explain that one, Mark. Under the dereliction sites legislation, the owner of the property sought to challenge it by way of judicial review. However, he had been declared bankrupt and the court had to decide whether he had standing to challenge that order. And this is the case of Tobin versus Limerick City, and it's a High Court decision of Mr. Justice Simons.
Yeah. So the derelict sites legislation makes provision particularly for in urban areas where buildings are falling derelict and the local authorities feel that it's sort of reducing the impression of the area, the standard of the area. And so they're allowed to effectively put the owner on notice and say, if you don't fix this up, we can issue a derelict sites order and the property will then vest in the local authority and the local authority can either do it up or sell it. But so vesting simply means moving it into the ownership of the local authority. In this particular case, the person who was at least the nominal owner had been declared bankrupt. And of course, the effect of bankruptcy is that you no longer own your property. It all gets vested in the official assignee in bankruptcy. And so when he sought to challenge the vesting order, the local authority said, well, you don't have the standing to bring this application. It can only be brought by the official assignee in bankruptcy. And the court agreed with that submission. They said that if the person who had owned the property wanted to challenge the order, he needed to basically make the submission to the official assignee in bankruptcy.
Okay, very good. Really well explained there. Okay, let's move to our second case. And this is a derogation licence which had been granted in relation to a development concerning bats. Oh, wow. Judicial review had already been refused concerning the substantive development, but the applicant sought to challenge the derogation licence separately. You're going to have to tell us about what issues arose here. I remember many, many moons ago, we had Fred Logan here, who's a well-known solicitor in this area of law. And he talked about bats being, very prevalent amongst planning decisions and judicial reviews and, the habits and the mating habits and the flying habits and the whatever habits they have of bats. Well, so tell us more.
The Habitats Directive and the various wildlife directives come into play here. And what happened here is that the planning permission had been given for a particular development. And then as part of that, if it affects certain habitats, you get what they call a derogation license, which, as far as I can understand, means that you're entitled to interfere with the habitat of a particular species. And this one concerned bat roosts, foraging and commuting. The issue was that they sought to challenge in the same proceedings, both the planning permission and the derogation license. And the court refused judicial review of the planning permission. But then they said, yeah, but you have to treat the derogation license separately because it is decided separately. And the point was that not only is it decided separately, but because it doesn't come under the planning and development legislation, different time limits apply. So it's not subject to the narrow planning time limits. It's subject to the general 3-month time limit.
Mark, I can't believe this. You can talk about bats, and here you go again, talking about
time limits.
Time limits.
But when it comes to judicial review, time limits are all important, I'm afraid.
And I should say that that's the case of O'Donnell versus On Board Planola, and who else but Mr. Justice Richard Humphreys gave that decision. Okay.
Well, I should just say that this is one where basically he was looking for further submissions, and it's a matter that may be referred to the Court of Justice of the European Union.
Okay, very good. And thank you for that clarification. Okay, finally, we have an airline employee who claimed to have been injured during a hard landing. She sought discovery of the cockpit voice recordings and claimed that she was entitled to them. So this is the case of Pertl versus Aer Lingus Limited, and it was a decision of Mr. Justice Simons.
Yeah, so as we all know, there is a recording that happens in cockpits, and when there has been a serious crash, then they get listened to find out what gave rise to the crash. But in this case, the airline employee claimed that the airplane had come down in such a way that she got injured. And she said, well, we know that they record the cockpit, the conversation of the pilot. I should be entitled to this because it may affect my case. The defence to that application...
Please don't tell me she was out of time.
But you'll be glad to know this has nothing to do with time limits. The defence effectively was that these recordings should only be released in certain very specific circumstances, and that if you generally allowed them to be released, they might have a chilling effect on the kind of conversations that pilots had with each other. So that pilots shouldn't be sort of feel, oh well, every time I'm flying a plane, I need to be careful of what I say. And so, if an ordinary personal injuries case arises, you shouldn't just hand over the cockpit voice recording. And I think I'm right in saying that she was allowed sort of a few seconds before and after the landing, but that was it. But yes, what the judge said was pilots might be more circumspect in their communications, and in the case of private aircraft in particular, pilots might choose not to install or operate voice recording equipment.
Okay, so, interesting decision. I mean, yeah. I can see the reasoning of the judge in relation to that. But on the other hand, I mean, it's not privileged conversation, or it's not a privileged statement, etc.
Well, it effectively is privileged, I suppose, from the way he's treating it.
So that's the judge has found that, has he?
Yeah.
Okay, wow, that's interesting. Well, we know the kind of, I suppose, the pilot, like the captain of a ship, is basically in charge, isn't that it? I mean, the captain of a ship can marry you and do all these sort of things.
I don't know if pilots are allowed to marry.
When the plane is up in the middle of the sky. I don't know. Okay, really well explained, Mark. And we're back shortly with the Director General of the Law Society, Mark Garrett.
Silence in the Fifth Court.
Well, it is my great pleasure to welcome to the show the Director General of the Law Society, Mark Garrett. Mark, you're very welcome to the Fifth Court.
Thanks very much. I'm delighted to be here.
We've been chasing you for a little while. You're now almost 2 years in the role?
It'll be 2 years in January, indeed.
Okay, and you're well settled. Okay, well, we're going to talk about the realities of running the solicitor's body later in this interview. But first, I want to go right back to the start. Mark, you have an incredible backstory, which I know a little bit about. But first, you're a County Mayo man, isn't that it?
Absolutely, from Ballina, County Mayo on the Moy. Great to see Joe Biden there earlier in the year, and was back for the event as well. The town never looked better.
Okay, I actually was there myself that night. It was a very special evening. Now, I met you for the first time. We have a mutual pal, and we were at a wedding in County Cork many moons ago. And at the time, you were working in PR, I think, and you were working for the late, great Bill O'Herlihy.
Indeed, a very proud Cork man indeed. Absolutely, yeah. No, look, it was my first job out of college, working with Bill. Learned a lot from him. In fairness, it was an academy for an awful lot of people I've met in my career over the years who were through Bill's hands over the years. I really enjoyed working with Bill. the personality you saw on television or radio is exactly what you worked with as well. Fantastic guy, really learned an awful lot from him. And lots of people who I worked with there, including Bride Rosny, unfortunately, who died recently.
And was advisor to Mary Robinson, of course.
And lots of other great colleagues who I met there and still very friendly with as well. So I really enjoyed that time.
And what was it about Bill? He was a very special person, wasn't he?
Well, there was something about him, is that the sense of, never mind the enthusiasm he had for whatever he got involved in, that he wore his Cork pride on his sleeve.
Wasn't that it?
Absolutely. I won't even try and do the details there. But I mean, even to a point where he always drove a Cork registered car and made sure no matter when he got a new car, it had a Cork reg on it. So he wore it on his sleeve. There's no doubt about it. Okay.
And from there you went on and worked in... Was it from there you went in? I think I suppose Bill O'Hurley, he was associated with Fine Gael. I think there's no great mystery about that. And
one of the national handlers from the 1980s.
National handlers with Garrett Fitzgerald, wasn't he? He was very close with Garrett Fitzgerald. Yeah. And I think there's no mystery that you had an association with the Labour Party once upon a time. And was it from there that you went into working with Eamon Gilmore, or was there a few steps in between?
There was certainly a few steps in between, all right. Yeah, no, I worked at Bill for a number of years, but then, I went on and did quite a bit of time working in the public sector in Ireland here, both for the Digital Hub agency to look and develop in the Liberties area of Dublin, fantastic part of Dublin, looking to build that into a digital, I suppose, enterprise zone for the city and for the country. And then I also worked in the Competition Authority for a number of years as well. So very much my public sector stint before actually myself and my wife moved to New York from that. Okay, and it was when I was in New York, I was working with McKinsey for a number of years there. And while I was there and we were contemplating our future, just applied for our green cards, I got a call from Eamon Gilmore asking me would I do a job for him, come back and be his chief of staff after he'd been elected leader of the Labour Party in end of 2007.
Now, we are going to talk about the Law Society, but I can't let this one go. So 2011, obviously huge general election, country in economic crisis at the time. Troika had landed in town prior to that, etc. And you came in as chief advisor to the Taoiseach, Eamon Gilmore. Was that your role?
Yep, that's right. And my job was to oversee the Taoiseach's office and the running of the Labour part of that government in collaboration with the chief of staff for the Taoiseach. So the chief of staff of the Taoiseach and the Taoiseach would meet on a probably bi-weekly basis just to look at what the legislative agenda was, what are the practical workings of government, what was happening in terms of legislative votes and all of that. So, yeah.
Okay. Well, I don't think you're bound by cabinet confidentiality. So you're not? Sure you're not?
No, well, you'd have to be in the cabinet.
I was all the inside story.
Never a member of cabinet. So no, I'm not. I'm certainly not. But I certainly am subject to the Official Secrets Act.
I'd say it was a very pressurised role, but I'd say it was a fascinating role.
Well, look, it was a privilege to do a role like that, especially at a time when the country was going through such trauma. And I think nobody gets into politics, no one gets into government to be in times like that. But I think, I worked with an amazing group of politicians, certainly, but also public servants at a time when Ireland was going through, you might call it, multiple crises. We certainly know about the collapse in the banking system. We know in terms of public finances, it also collapsed. The housing market, it collapsed. The economy, it collapsed. You think about all these things all happening at the same time, where ultimately there was nobody to lend money to the Irish economy in a way that I must admit I've been looking on jealously, I suppose, to a certain extent, with the recent budgetary processes that government have been able to go through in the last couple of years. And it's fantastic to see.
The Labour Party got a lot of kicking for their role in that government. Do you think that's unfair?
Look, I have a lot of pride in what we achieved during that time. You think about the 2011-2016 government, we can go through an awful lot of detail in it if we want to. But I think I certainly have a lot of pride in it. There's no doubt there were political and electoral consequences to that. And I think the Labour Party suffered probably more than its fair share in regard to that. And I think there's a real opportunity, I think, in every time you're in government to shape the agenda. And that's certainly what the Labour Party has always done. So I think very proud of that time. Doesn't mean we didn't make mistakes and we could have, and should have maybe done different things, or, people will point out where we were flawed in our methodology or our decision making. And, we're human, as every other organisation is. But absolutely, when you look back in terms of where the country was at the end of that government, people kind of forget in many ways, restoring minimum wages, going back to a point where that was a period of government where more classrooms were built in that period of government than at any other time in our history. And you think about in terms of what did we prioritise in terms of that.
And
the level
libraries.
And libraries too, in terms of, about school book rentals and various other aspects of that. Think about the social change that came in, legislation for the X case for the first time, which had been talked about for a long time, but actually achieved under that government. You look at the issues around the 2 referendum that quickly followed in terms of marriage equality, and again in terms of repeal the 8th. Huge amount of change, huge amount of economic stability restored, a lot of renegotiation with the Troika. There were certainly programmes and imposed, I suppose, and put on, but a huge amount of negotiations. People forget a little bit of now, and that's understandable. We've moved on a long time since then. But the likes of the promissory note, remember when we knew all the details of what these were? And I think there's a huge amount it's yet to be written and reflected upon about that time.
Fascinating, Mark. Absolutely. And you had a couple of jobs in between. You worked with Glanbia, I know, for a while.
Indeed.
In the PR game again, and head of communications. And then you were with Teneo, famous company as well.
Indeed.
And then, did you put in your application to become Director General of the Law Society, or did somebody tap you on the shoulder, or how did that happen?
Yeah,
new change of direction.
I certainly got a call and asked would I be interested. And I suppose, look, the big theme, I suppose, of all of my career has been around public policy, shaping policy, being involved at a governmental level in the public sector and in the private sector. So the theme all the way through, I think there's a real opportunity in the Law Society, as I saw it, in terms of knowing that the central role law plays in Irish society in shaping how we live every facet of our lives. And I think there's a real opportunity, and I saw it as such to help shape and lead that, and very interested in doing so. And
you're taking over after Ken Murphy's 25 years?
I think Ken was in the role for 26 years, but then he was actually, I took over from Mary Kane, who did the role for a year, first woman to be Director General of the Law Society, and fellow Mayo person who did the role for most of 2021.
Right, okay. Yeah. But in terms of the sort of the long-term strategy, are you looking now at strategies kind of 20 years in advance, or what kind of time frame are you looking at?
Well, I think if we've learned anything over the last number of years, looking ahead for 20 years and trying to predict what's going to happen is a fool's game. My crystal ball, and I've yet to meet anyone whose crystal ball can work like that, but we certainly are looking at, as every organisation does, look at a 5-year strategy. In fact, the current strategy runs out at the end of 2023, so it's timely. We've spent most of this year looking at what our strategy will be for the next 5 and trying to plan ahead as best possibly can.
And this is strategy for the whole legal solicitor's profession, or the strategy for the Law Society? Is there kind of regulatory?
It's basically what role will the Law Society have in shaping the legal system in Ireland, and then helping the solicitor's profession itself thrive over the next 5 years, looking at the challenges, looking at the opportunities. And, there's lots out there. There's no doubt that it's a profession that is growing, huge demand for the services.
Okay,
and
Mark,
lots to talk about in that area.
Can we look at the numbers? Let's start at the beginning, basically. Okay. So how many solicitors do you represent? What's the figures?
Yeah, there are 12,000, just under 12,000 practicing solicitors in Ireland at the moment. And I suppose to give a bit of context to that, this is in 2023, we're commemorating the centenary of the first women to become solicitors back in 1923, following a change in the law, which obviously excluded them back from a lot of professions in advance of that. There were 1,000 solicitors in Ireland at that point. It took 75 years for that to grow to 4,500. So 25 years ago, we had 4,500, and today we have 12,000. So exponential growth, really significant. Probably a historical number of trainees coming through the system as well, and huge demand for services in all aspects, very much reflecting, I think, the growth in the Irish economy, the sophistication of the Irish society and economy all the time. So there's lots of change there and lots of growth.
So Mark, you're describing a mushroom cloud there, basically. Suddenly in the last, as you say, 10 years, 20 years, this massive growth, doubling, trebling almost of solicitors. Why? What's gone on? What's happening?
Well, I think it's quite clear that it reflects, first of all, it's more a mosaic, I would suggest, is the image I would portray. As it's becoming a very diversified profession. We no longer have that standard model of large firm in urban areas, small generalist firm in areas outside the main cities. It's very much a huge growth in in-house counsel. 25% of the solicitor's profession is now in-house, growing to 30% as we see it. Again, a growing demand for legal advice, regulation in all areas. There's no issue at this moment in time that government isn't expected to solve overnight. That usually means additional legislation, additional regulation, enforcement of, and advice and legal services needed. We also saw huge economic growth, investment in Ireland over the last 25 years through foreign direct investment. We have huge multinational companies here now working, operating, and in need of services, whether they be accountancy service, whether they be catering services, whether they be legal services. They're expanding at a rate, and so are the professions as allied with them. And the legal is no different from that.
And outside the 75%, presumably we now have a reasonably large number that are international firms that have set up shop in Ireland, a reasonably large number who are large commercial Dublin firms, effectively. Obviously, there are large commercial firms outside Dublin, but predominantly here. And then what proportion are still kind of high street kind of, family firms? Or,
Well, it's basically, you look at it, it's not quite as blocked out as that in terms of into individual blocks, because you now have small individual firms specialising in key areas, intellectual property, data, employment law, and so on. So and then you have what you're talking about is the traditional model of approximately, one or a small number of solicitors in family-run firms, offering community-based services, and that's about a third of the profession.
It's still as much as
absolutely.
Okay.
But you're talking about, that mosaic now extends into international firms that have moved into Ireland, Irish firms that now are selling their international services abroad. We're in an international market, so there's no doubt that the solicitor's profession is thriving in many ways. But it's not thriving for everyone, and it's not thriving everywhere. And that's clearly the view.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that's come up on the show before, that the real challenge is, as far as I can see, for the high street firms, it's certainly been said, and I think it's correct, that trainees going into the big commercial firms are now paid something like $50,000 a year, and your high street firm in Dublin or elsewhere simply can't afford that kind of money for a trainee if they're doing conveyancing, wills, family law, district court representation, that kind of, the sort of thing that people generally have to go to a solicitor for. Is that something that the Law Society can assist with?
Well, I think there's no doubt that when you want to find out what's going on in the legal profession or in any other areas, was big believer in asking people what the issues are. And that's one of the things we've done as part of the background for our strategy, is we had very extensive survey of solicitors around the country. And there's no doubt, again, what came up through that, and we were very lucky to get over 2,260 of our solicitor members responded to that, which is a huge response. And there's no doubt that is one of the areas, but it's not the only area. There's challenges in other areas, but let's delve into this one for the moment. There's no doubt that this is an issue. It's been there for some time, but it's not unique to Ireland. And it's not unique to the legal profession either. We see this with GPs in similar areas.
So recent reports from that research, Mark? Tell us.
It shows that the similar issues with other professionals, veterinary surgeons and others, that what they're under pressure is the costs, the burden of regulation. There's no doubt there as well that what they're seeing is the talent, as you say, getting people to join the firm, getting people to buy the firm out, to succession planning, all of these issues. Talking to colleagues in other jurisdictions, in Northern Ireland, in Scotland, in England and Wales, in those law societies, exactly the same issues. This is something right across the board that the profession is struggling with. And I think there's lots of good ideas. We have a number of programs in place right now. We do practice support grants in areas where there hasn't been a trainee for some time, where we can financially support a firm to take on a trainee. We have access programs for trainees where they are challenged financially. For any reason, they can go through our courses, and there's quite a bit of effort done on that every single year. But I think there's a real societal challenge here. Last year, we had 11 counties in Ireland which had either only one or no trainee. My home county of Mayo, one trainee last year. That has increased to 13 counties this year. We have 92% of our trainees are from every county in Ireland, but they are working within Dublin-based firms. So that's 92% of the current intake of trainees.
But we're realistically talking about a situation where, going back to my question about the long term, in 20 years' time, it might be difficult to find somebody to do your conveyance, to draft your will, to represent you in the local court, as it may be to find a GP. I mean, it's a problem with the professions.
We're absolutely we absolutely agree with that. That the idea that we're now seeing is what we're calling legal potential for the growth of legal deserts, areas where you will not be able to access legal services in your local community. And we think that's a real challenge. And I think we want to make sure we're not trying to solve that on our own, because that's not possible. This is a societal issue. This is one where, access to justice, access to that legal support in usually in tough circumstances or where people are vulnerable is one where that has to be provided at a societal level. And we have to, I think, join forces with the likes of other professionals, such as the doctors, such as the vets, such as the pharmacists and others, because those are services that need to be provided if we want to have a thriving rural Ireland. And it's really important.
But Mark, when you say societal, I mean, that they're shocking figures. I can't get over those. I mean, it sounds like, sort of priestly vocations or something. I mean, it's kind of one trainee in the whole of Mayo, a big county like Mayo, all the firms in all the towns and villages in Mayo, and only one trainee. I mean, that's absolutely shocking. Yeah. I mean, you say it's societal, but societal is kind of, in one way, does that sound a bit like kicking it to touch from the Law Society's point of view? Because, I mean, you actively have to get involved and try and change that.
Well, I think we have to get active and are actively involved, and there's a number of programs already in place and more coming down the lines. We've evolved new programs, a hybrid program for trainees, whereby you don't have to be on block release in Dublin to become a trainee. You can do that while keeping on your working and caring responsibilities in other parts of the country. And we're noticing the demographic change in that course is substantially different from the traditional courses. But we're also challenging, public sector is one that I have conversations with on a regular basis who say they can't afford to hire a solicitor based on public sector rates. And one of the challenges I would say is it's time to grow some of that talent as well. Last year, of almost 500 trainees, 2 of them came from the public sector. And huge demand, growing demand in the public sector for legal advice and
so
for
they
people
need to
who
provide
develop.
apprenticeships. Is that what
Exactly.
you're saying? Yes.
But there's a real opportunity there that if you're just in and grow talent and bring that along and bring people at different career stages through the process. We're exploring other areas of where using the new apprenticeship model, using various other aspects of legal education. But we think that there's also an opportunity for others to look at this. And I think in-house counsel and the public sector needs to look at these areas and grow opportunities for people, because there's no shortage of demand for trainees. There's no shortage of demand for solicitors. There's no shortage of demand for legal services. And that's a good thing in a healthy economy and a healthy society and a healthy legal system. And those are the positives. The challenge is making sure we have the opportunities, because the survey also shows we're losing talent within the profession. I mean, the Law Society did a very significant report just about 2 years ago, which showed that about bullying, harassment and sexual harassment at very significant levels within the profession. Now, I don't think the legal profession is any different or massively different from any other walk of life. I think, at the very least, the Law Society, predating me, was brave enough to look at that, publish a detailed report and look at actions of which we're going through. But there's no doubt that we are losing people from the profession because of the demands that are placed on them, the type of atmosphere that they have or environment they have to work in.
To other areas of work. They're just leaving the law altogether.
They are both leaving the law together. They're leaving the law altogether, or they're moving to other areas, or they're reducing their hours, whatever it happens to be. There's no doubt that some parts of the profession are not adapting to the needs of the modern workforce.
It sounds like a lot of them are heading from the western seaboard up to the quays along the River Liffey there, with all those big skyscrapers. Yeah. I mean, is that how do you manage that, Mark? I mean, obviously everybody's entitled to do whatever they want to do, and we believe in a free society. I mean, in my father's house, there are many rooms, and obviously you, in managing the Law Society, you have a number of rooms that you have to look after. But I mean, it's becoming packed heavy with kind of corporate lawyers at the moment. Are they putting their shoulder to the wheel in trying to redress the issues generally that apply across the society, or are they just kind of, concerned with their own issues?
Yeah, it's been put to me by a number of bar associations around the country in a similar manner. And I must admit, I don't buy the premise. It's not one lawyer against another lawyer or one part of the profession against another part of the profession. On many levels, they're servicing very different markets. If we don't have those large corporate accountancy firms or large commercial law firms, you don't have the Googles, the Facebooks, and those other multinationals in a sophisticated modern economy, which drives a huge amount of our economic activity in this country, the jobs,
but
the society, whatever else.
The expensive housing, the shortage of housing.
Exactly.
There are challenges arising from these.
And these are the really significant societal challenges that we have to address. And if we don't have long-term focused thinking and strategy around those, then that's not something. And I think it's actually mature of anybody to say, we alone can't do this.
But when you're talking about people when you're talking about people who find the work too challenging, it sounds as if you're talking about the people who effectively get burned out after 10 or more years working in a busy commercial firm. But I imagine at that stage, their skill set is not such that they're going to go, well, why don't I move to Ballina and start working in conveyancing and probate and district court and family law and that kind of thing? I mean, is there a route back from the people who want to step away from the busy commercial work?
I think you're conflating an awful lot of things in one question there. I think it's not as simple as that. I think the reality, people go into different layers of the career. They use the law to go off and do other things. And I think they just either step away for a while and come back again. And I think the reality here is that, in many walks of life, you have to have many paths through the profession, into the profession and across the profession. And that's it. It's not one monolith where skills in one area are easily transferred into another. It's become much more sophisticated than that. I think the reality here is that, if you're a particular specialist in a particular area, some of those skills are transferable and some of them are not. But you could say that in many other walks of life. And I think we have to plan for the different needs of Irish society and the legal services. If we can't have a fully functioning, well-attuned legal system in this country without a thriving legal profession in all its elements. And I think that includes servicing that sophisticated economic model that we now have in this country, which has grown exponentially over the last number of decades, through to providing those community-based services which people need to function, to buy a house, for probate, for all of these issues that they have, family disputes that need to unfortunately go through those court systems. And you go back to the 1970s, the Law Reform Commission in Ireland called for a specialised family law court in Ireland in the 1970s, right. One of their first ever reports. We still haven't got that. Yes. That's not something that, that's something that we have to make sure we work with others to get as well.
Can I talk to you? And I'm kind of curious as well. I mean, when you talk about kind of, the rural versus the urban, etc. I mean, traditionally, I would have thought the solicitor in the town was a very well-respected profession. And, people kind of, a bit like the TD and whatever, back in the good old days, there was kind of a certain status associated with that. And I'm sure there is. But generally, what is the perception, do you find, from the Law Society's point of view, of solicitors? We recently we did a history of the barrister's profession. And, I think it was acknowledged that as a result of maybe involvement in tribunals, etc., that barristers took a bit of a bashing from the public, whereas traditionally people had a kind of a wholesome enough view of the barrister. What about solicitors? What's the general perception of solicitors out there?
Yeah, look, I mean, again, there's still, in the public perception, there's still a very well-regarded profession, but that doesn't mean, like almost every other walk of life, I think trust in any institution, any profession has diminished over the years. And that's the case with solicitors as well. I think, there's an awful lot of conversation in the public domain about the cost of legal services, not necessarily about the value. I mean, something that we might have taken for granted 5, 10, 15 years ago is the rule of law, that it's a core function of having an independent judiciary, a court system that works, an independent legal profession, a free media. All of those things that we took for granted for so long, unfortunately, have been questioned by events in recent years, where I think we have to reestablish what is the value we place on these things. And I think there's no doubt that, the solicitor is still valued in his local community, or in his or her local community. But I think there's no doubt that there's more to be done to make sure we talk about the role of the law in making sure we have a well-functioning society. And I think that's elevating the conversation into the value of the law, rather than just talking about the cost or, as you say, the tribunals in the case of barristers.
So we've talked a lot about the various problems facing the profession, and you are now developing a 5-year strategy, is it? Yeah. And what do you see, what are your priorities in the strategy?
Well, look, I mean, the strategy is premised on it's a profession that is not only well regarded, but also one that people want to get into, and that there's huge demand for the services. And its core function in shaping and supporting the legal system in Ireland and ensuring that solicitors are thriving in every community in Ireland. So those are the key elements of the strategy. And that's building on really solid foundations in terms of our education and regulatory functions.
But what are the actual components of the strategy that, when it comes to, for example, helping the high street firms?
Yeah, well, I think the point here is that we are looking to help the profession in all its elements. And I think in terms of providing services that are relevant to our key members in every aspect to it, they break down into 3 areas. We provide information services. We do a huge amount in terms of library services, online services. There's a huge amount of information that is available, precedents and so on, that are used by the profession. And we intend to expand those information services. There's then career support. So we do that in terms of a returners program, people who are coming back into the profession after taking a break for careering or other reasons. And we provide people, there's a mentoring program for many others as well who want to have that. There's a lot then in regard to information supports which come with CPD. And then I think we have practice support. We talked about that area of assisting people in terms of understanding what their needs and I suppose responsibilities are in terms of regulation, in terms of providing, I suppose, opportunities in terms of running the business side, which is really, really important for a lot of people get into the law to do the law, not necessarily to run the business and need support and all those. So there's a huge range of services that are available in which we need to expand as well.
Now, Mark, that's great. And I'm sure solicitors are well aware of this and will be very encouraged by what you've just said there. What about organisations like Solicitors Growth? We've had Flo McCarthy, for example, on this show, who was brilliant and talked about, the work they did and how they kind of filled it. Now, I know he was very much involved with the Law Society, but they sort of have they filled a vacuum that maybe the Law Society wasn't catering for?
Well, I think, look, first of all, I mean, the idea that there's numerous people offering services to solicitors, it's not just the Law Society. And isn't that a good thing? I mean, the idea that there is an opportunity for others. And I think we're doing a huge amount in terms of education, CPD and other areas, and others are spotting other gaps. And I think that's a healthy environment. It's we're in a competitive environment in this area as we are in others, and that's a good thing. I think we learn from what others are offering, and I think they learn from what we're offering, and that's a good thing.
Mark, we're getting there. We're getting very close to wrapping it up. Can I just ask you on a personal level? I mean, as you said there earlier, you succeeded Mary Keane, and before that, Ken Murphy, who seems to be in the position forever and a day. I think both of them were solicitors. You're not. You're a civilian. You're a normal functioning member of society. And how is that coming into a profession, where it's so kind of solicitor orientated and you came from kind of the corporate world?
Well, Mary Kane would kill me if I didn't say she's a barrister rather than a solicitor.
Oh, very good.
There you go.
Okay.
But I think the very basic thing, I haven't been hired for my legal advice. There's enough legal advice around the organisation, and I suppose my expertise is around public policy and shaping public policy, understanding, first of all, that the law and the lawyers have a huge role in shaping public policy, but also that public policy shapes the profession. The environment in which the profession has to exist is shaped by public policy largely, and that's a key thing for the Law Society and for lawyers to be influential and increase our voice, and having a more influential voice in that space is really, really important.
And just even from your own personal experience, I mean, coming from the corporate world that you were involved in and government and various different things, I mean, was there anything specific about suddenly working with all these solicitors that you found different, or was it unusual? I'm just trying to see, was there anything that kind of, that just jumped out at you when you joined the legal profession?
Well, clearly, all the way through my career, I've had, great interactions with lawyers of different, I suppose, expertise, knowledge and interest and personalities all the way through. So there's always valued the expertise that they bring to the table. And I think the one thing that the law in general provides is some people who are really detail orientated. They have to be across the detail, and sometimes that's fantastic. And I suppose the opportunity to then bring a bigger picture of that on occasions, and the phrase I use on occasions, it's all fine in a court of law, but in the court of public opinion, it can be slightly different.
Well, you're the master of that.
And we have to bring both of those perspectives. And I think when you put a team together that is both detailed orientated and has that strategic perspective, you have a real opportunity to make an impact.
Well, Mark, I think our half an hour is up. I see our producer is waving frantically at the window here. He won't let us go any further, Mark. We have a little question that we always asked at the end of this. I don't know whether I said this to you, but I think you might know from previous. Any book, any movie that you'd like to recommend to our listeners?
Look, I'm a history buff, so I suppose more I'm in the podcast space as I am here today. So look, the rest is
pushing an open door with
there
that.
There you go.
Anyway.
So I must admit, in fairness to Goalhanger Productions, who are my favourite podcast goers these days. So the rest is history, the rest is politics, and Empire is my latest one, I suppose. Really interesting one.
Their series on the Russian Empire was gobsmacking.
And they've just started on the Persian Empire, and it's fantastic as well. So I got to say, there's
all
my
thanks to the great Gary Lineker.
There you go.
And I think it's important to point out that the Royal Academy in London has given The Rest is History its medal, the first podcast to get it. And I don't know if there's an equivalent medal that can be given for podcasts in Ireland, but I think we should certainly make people aware of medals given to
Sandbrook
podcasters.
and Holland. They're fantastic. Yeah,
and I really enjoyed it. They were in Dublin relatively recently, early this year, I went along. It was an absolutely fantastic show. The idea that, shall we say, two people can stand up on a stage and just talk history to a full Vicar Street is certainly an indication that things have moved on.
No, wonderful recommendation. Anybody who hasn't been listening to The Rest is History, you got to start. Mark, this has been brilliant. So Mark Garrett, Director General of the Law Society, thank you for coming in and being a guest on the Fifth Court.
The Fifth Court will adjourn until next week.
So that's all from this edition of the Fifth Court. We hope you have enjoyed it. Can I say a huge thank you to our guest, Director General of the Law Society, Mark Garrett, who came in and talked to us about his 5-year plans and the issues facing the solicitor's profession. I cannot get over what he said to us about, let's say, in the county of Mayo, one trainee alone.
Yeah.
Come on, what's going on?
Yeah. No, the appeal of the regions doesn't seem to apply to the professions these days. And as he said, in fairness, it's not just the solicitor's profession. You know, it's just as hard to get trainee GPs to work down the country or in smaller towns.
Yeah, and like it really is shocking. I mean, as he said, it is societal, and it is very much in society's interest that sort of imbalance is redressed. It's a hard one to do, but it is worrying. I mean, we do need, services throughout the country. We are one nation, as the fella says. Okay. Before we go, can I say a huge thank you to our producer, Conal O'Moroyne, and to Lee Brennan of the Dublin South Podcast Studios for their wonderful work in helping us put this show together. So for me, Peter Leonard.
And myself, Mark Tottenham.
Thank you for listening, and we'll see you soon in the Fifth Court.